Alright, so much for the Korean War. I mean, when I was in college, I read a book about it, and I did a report on it. I read a book about it, in college, and did a report on it one time. Hey, there's a whole lot more that could be said. The American prisoners of war, when the war was over, they wanted to side with the communists. In the meantime, the North Koreans who we captured, they didn't want to go home. They wanted to remain away from the communists. But the war ended in what you might call a truce. Now, Vietnam, that was another matter. In the case of Vietnam, when World War II ended, the whole world turned against colonialism, and Great Britain, being the biggest colonial power on the face of the earth, began releasing all its colonies. The French, however, wanted to keep Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh became the leader of Vietnam, and he rebelled against the French. He once told the French ambassador, "You can kill my people at a ratio of 10 to 1, but I have so many men, I'll just keep coming back, and I have more men than you can send over here, and I'll defeat you." The French tried to fight. The Vietnamese won and drove the French out. Then here comes the somewhat goldish part of the story. The United States was determined that we're not going to give in another country to the communists. So the United States at that point moved in and took the French place. And at first we got involved slowly. We at first sent people we called advisors. There just to advise the South Vietnamese. And when it became obvious we were losing, we started sending American troops to actually do the fighting. And we sent wave after wave of troops, and the Vietnam War was to last about 12 years, depending on when you counted having begun and when it ended. And it ended with a complete American defeat. After North Vietnam and the United States signed a treaty of peace, which North Vietnam subsequently broke and invaded South Vietnam, and this time the United States would not do anything at all to help the South Vietnamese. And South Vietnam fell to the North. I mean, and we'll have more to say about the war later, but this is summing it up in detail. In summing it up, not in detail, but not going in detail. North Vietnam got a little bit of help from China and none from Russia. I'll say this now. I mean, we will be getting back to the Vietnam War a little bit later. But the North Vietnamese are known to have gone through a period of discouragement. And they said, how can we whip the United States? Russia was not giving them any help, and China was just giving them token aid. And they said, how can we stand against the United States? They have everything. Then they noticed the American college students rioting on the campuses, burning their draft cards and saying, we won't go, fleeing the country to escape the draft. And they said one to another, if we can just hold out a little while longer, their young people will force them out of the war. They held out a little bit longer. And in our country, we got tired of war and left. That's not all the story. I mean, again, I'm talking more about my generation folk than yours. My generation were the draft card burners. My generation were the ones who fled to Sweden to escape. I didn't want to go to Vietnam either, so I stayed in school for a while. That's one reason I have a master's degree. I mean, I'll admit to you. Later I joined. When the war was over, I joined the Army. I had a change of heart. And I joined the National Guard for 6 years. But I trained along with the regular Army. But during the Vietnam era itself, I simply did not want to really fight that war. And I am not at all sure, I debate in my mind often, did we have any business being over there? My sergeants in the Army who were Vietnam vets told us we had no business over there. There was one attempt at a democratic election, which it wasn't the Soviets that stopped it. It wasn't the Chinese. The United States stopped the election because we knew that the communists would win the election. Well, if we are if we're a democracy, and they devote communism in, why not let communism take over? After they've had their share of it for a while, they'll quit. I mean, hey, in our own country, in Great Britain too, these political parties, the party in power always gets blamed when something goes wrong, and the people revert to the next party. When something goes wrong, and there's always something going to go wrong. Something goes wrong, the party in power gets blamed, so the people will blame the other party. This is fundamental politics. If we had just left the Vietnamese alone, when they did go communistic, the rest of Southeast Asia did not go along with them. All right. Back to Europe. In Europe, Joseph Stalin died under mysterious circumstances, and I gave this same lecture a couple of years back, and one of my pupils had a computer, a laptop from him. He looked up and said, yes, it is true, there are some mysterious circumstances surrounding Stalin's death, so I looked it up myself, and there are rumors that he was actually killed, and one person claimed, yes, I killed Stalin, that Stalin was actually shot to death, assassinated by someone in the party. This cannot be proven. But Stalin died. There was a power struggle. Eventually, the man who took charge was Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev. Now, again, most of you might not remember him, might not have heard of him. If you had grown up when I did, you'd have heard of him, because Nikita Khrushchev was premier of the Soviet Union from the time I was 4 years old until the time I was 15, inclusive. That's basically 12 years inclusive. Actually, I believe I was 15 when he was finally kicked out of power. And when I was a kid, the girls who got mad at each other would say to each other, "You like Nikita Khrushchev," or "You look like Nikita Khrushchev." Nikita Khrushchev was a warty old frog, with all due respect. I mean, quite old. In fact, for the next several years, the Soviet Union was being run by old men. But Nikita Khrushchev, one of his first acts was he surprised the world by getting in front of the crowd and denouncing Stalin. I mean, he ran Stalin to the ground. And then he said, now we can get along with the West. We've put forth the policy of peaceful coexistence. Peaceful coexistence. No, we can coexist. And he said that eventually communism will triumph without firing a shot. And the United Nations would meet every September. Now today, nobody even realizes that the UN General Assembly still meets every September, but the press doesn't even go anymore. But Khrushchev would get in front of the General Assembly. He'd oftentimes take his shoe off and bang his shoe on the desk in anger, and he'd say, "Wrong, wrong." And somebody else would, "Hey, Khrushchev, if there's no God, who's to say what's right or what is wrong? What is wrong? What is right?" But he would point his finger at the camera, and the way the people of America looked, it looked like he was pointing his finger at that dam and say, "We'll bury you." Well, he explained, hey, what I mean by that was communism is going to triumph, and we're going to triumph without firing a shot. And anyway, what actually happened was the Soviet Union itself fell without firing a shot. Just what he predicted would happen to us wound up happening to him. Things were not always peaceful, though. In 1956, all right, this one means something to me. In 1956, Hungary revolted. Now, this is like the first international crisis I remember. right, so what actually happened during the Truman's and Eisenhower's administration? The country went through one crisis after another. The crisis would go back and forth. It would be Berlin, and the press would talk about Berlin for maybe 2 or 3 weeks. Then Berlin would kind of die down, and it would be Lebanon, and they'd talk about Lebanon. Then it would be the Congo, and they'd talk about the Congo for several weeks, and then they would get to Hungary, and they talked about Hungary for about 2 or 3 months. Then it would be Berlin again, go back and forth. But the first international crisis I remember was the Hungary crisis. And that's when my dad had a talk with me and explained to me that there was Russia and they were on opposite sides. And I could picture Russia as being the big bully on the block. And my dad believed at the time that Russia was bigger than we were, which was true, and that Russia had a better army than we did, and that we could not whip Russia. That's when we had to allow the Russians to take over Hungary. But essentially what happened in 1956, Hungary revolted against the Soviets, and Khrushchev, who had claimed to be peaceful, all of a sudden moved in with a bunch of tanks, killed the Hungarian leader, and made sure that Hungary stayed behind the Iron Curtain. Now folks, this was the type of adventures that Russia went on. Hungary revolted thinking that the rest of the world would come to their aid. The rest of the world was afraid of nuclear war, and by this time Russia had the nuclear bomb. They had stolen it from us. And nobody came to Hungary's aid, and Hungary lost. So this round went not to the United States, but went to the Soviet Union. Now eventually, the Hungarians told the Russians, go home and stay there, and the Russians went. But that was to come later. Poland. Poland also was to revolt. And in their revolution, the Soviets moved in and stopped Poland and told Poland, you're not going to become democratic, you're not going to become capital, you're going to remain socialistic. And this was to remain true until 1990, when finally the Polish people told the Soviets, go home. But again, that was to come later. The United States set up a shortwave radio station called Radio Free Europe. I'm not going to write that down, but essentially, I mean, I'm a ham radio operator, and I'm interested in shortwave. I listen to Radio Free Europe some of the time. And I also, believe it or not, I listen to Radio Moscow. They set up a shortwave station and beamed their signal in North America, and they could speak in very clear English and spread their propaganda to us. But shortwave radio is destined to be the means by which propaganda was spread. This was before the internet. Berlin. Berlin became another hot point after a while, with the Soviet Union trying to get all of Berlin behind the Iron Curtain. And what they finally did, they put up the Berlin Wall. Essentially, here's what was happening. A lot of people living in East Germany and East Berlin were sneaking across the border to freedom. So the Soviet Union and the East Germans and East Berliners put up a big wall. The wall was made of barbed wire, brick, and concrete, and maybe even in some cases steel, concrete blocks, anything that would block human progress. But the wall was not put up there to keep Westerners out of that communistic heaven that the communists had made. No, the wall was put up there to keep the people living under communism from escaping the communistic hell that the communist world had made. And it was to remain there for many, many years. And in fact, Ronald Reagan made a famous, he visited a wall and he said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. In 1990, the wall came down. There are pieces of it used as a souvenir to remind of what the world once was. But the wall was destined to come down in 1990. But the wall was built in 1961. And it kept tens of thousands of people who wanted to flee to freedom from fleeing, called the Berlin Wall.